It was early morning, the kind of quiet where even the refrigerator hum feels louder than it should. I remember standing in the garage, one hand on a half-finished setup I had been tinkering with for weeks, staring at a utility bill pinned to the wall. The numbers didn't make sense anymore. Same house, same usage, same habits. Higher bill, again. And for a moment, I just stood there thinking, if nothing about how we live changed, why does everything cost more every single month? That's not frustration. That's confusion turning into something heavier. And if you've ever opened your electricity bill and felt that same silence hit you for a second before the stress kicks in, you already know what this is really about. So the question is not why it's rising. The real question is, what is actually driving it up when nothing in your home changed? Most people in that position assume it's their fault, that they're using too much, or that they're missing something obvious. But when you zoom out, the pattern doesn't stay personal for very long. Electricity pricing isn't just based on usage anymore. It's tied to fuel markets, infrastructure strain, regional demand spikes, and increasingly unstable grid conditions that most homeowners never see until it affects them directly. In the last decade alone, energy costs in many regions have shifted from predictable billing cycles to fluctuating systems influenced by weather events, peak demand surges, and emergency grid interventions. And here's the part most people don't hear clearly enough. You're not just paying for electricity anymore. You're paying for instability being built into the system itself. I've spent years looking at how residential energy behavior actually interacts with grid infrastructure, not from a sales angle, from a structural one. And what becomes clear is simple. It's not individual usage driving unpredictability. It's the system itself becoming less stable, while pricing adapts in real time, called the instability gap. The growing distance between what homes expect from energy and what the grid can consistently deliver. And once you see that gap, you stop interpreting your bill as a reflection of your habits. Let's make this real. First scenario. It's a normal weekday evening. Lights on, dinner being prepared. A few appliances running at once without thinking about it. Nothing unusual. Then the bill arrives a few weeks later. Higher again. You go through everything mentally. Nothing changed. You start adjusting small habits, turning things off earlier, limiting usage in certain rooms. But the next bill barely moves. And that's where the internal thought usually lands quietly. Maybe I'm just not managing this well enough. But that conclusion misses what's actually happening in the background. Now, second scenario. A cold night or a heat wave. The kind where the grid gets stressed. You don't see it directly, but you feel it through warnings, brief outages, or reduced system performance in your area. Then comes the adjustment cycle from the utility side. Not always visible, but reflected later in pricing structures, peak demand charges, distribution adjustments, recovery balancing, and suddenly, a month of normal use doesn't matter. And this is where most people make a mistake that costs them months of confusion. They assume stability still exists in the system in a way it no longer does. Third scenario, a planned budget. You map out what you expect to spend on energy for the month. You even try to be conservative. Then one unexpected spike hits the system, regional demand, with a disruption infrastructure load, and your final bill breaks the pattern you were relying on, not dramatically at first, just enough to reset your expectation every time you try to stabilize it. And after a while, the conclusion becomes internal. I must be doing something wrong. And here's what all three of these situations have in common. They're not caused by behavior changes inside the home. They're caused by external instability being translated into your bill, that instability gap again. And once you see it clearly, you stop trying to fix the wrong variable. After enough cycles of that pattern, I stopped asking how to reduce usage. I started asking a different question. What would it look like if the home didn't fully depend on external fluctuations to define its baseline energy cost? That question led me into something I didn't initially expect to take seriously. A simple energy storage and conversion approach built around mechanical rotational systems, most commonly discussed in industrial contexts, but rarely translated into residential application in a practical way. Not as a replacement for the grid, but as a stabilizing layer between consumption and external volatility. The idea was straightforward. Instead of reacting to instability, create a buffer that smooths it. At first, the early versions were impractical, too complex, too expensive, or too fragile to be useful in a real household environment. But over time, a simpler configuration emerged, built around low-cost components, designed for accessibility rather than specialization. And what mattered wasn't the theory. It was whether it reduced dependence on external spikes and dips in real time. When it was tested in controlled setups, the most noticeable change wasn't dramatic output. It was consistency. Bills became less reactive to external volatility. Usage patterns stopped translating one-to-one into cost fluctuations. One household case stood out, not because it eliminated costs entirely, but because it reduced unpredictable swings that had been the main source of stress for years. That's the part most people miss. Stability itself has value. The immediate objection is obvious. Most people assume this kind of system requires engineering experience, expensive parts, or conditions that don't match a normal home environment. And in most cases, that assumption is correct if you're talking about industrial-grade systems. But simplified residential configurations change the equation entirely. Two households I observed had very different starting points. One was a retired couple with no technical background at all. Their goal wasn't optimization, it was predictability. After implementation, their biggest feedback wasn't about savings percentage. It was that their monthly variation narrowed significantly. The second was a working family dealing with high seasonal swings in energy costs. For them, the change wasn't elimination of bills, but reduced spikes during peak months. That alone made budgeting realistic again. In both cases, the principle was the same. They weren't trying to generate unlimited power. They were reducing exposure to external volatility. And that distinction is what makes the system conceptually different from most alternatives. It's not about maximum output. It's about controlled independence from instability. If nothing changes, the next few months will likely feel familiar. Small increases you can't fully explain. Occasional spikes tied to weather or demand shifts. A slow adjustment of what you consider normal when it comes to monthly energy costs. Not catastrophic, just gradually heavier. But if you introduce even a partial buffer between your home and those fluctuations, the experience changes. Not because everything becomes free or unlimited, but because the unpredictability starts to shrink. And once unpredictability shrinks, decision-making inside the home becomes easier again. You're no longer guessing what the next bill will look like. You're working with a more stable baseline. And it's fair to acknowledge something here. You've already been doing the hard part, managing consumption, adjusting habits, trying to stay ahead of something that keeps shifting underneath you. The missing piece hasn't been effort. It's been stability in the system you're responding to. Looking back, the pattern is easy to see in hindsight. Most people don't fail to manage energy well. They just try to optimize something that is no longer stable enough to optimize cleanly. If you want to see the framework I reference here, the system approach and how it's structured, I've left it in the description. If this helped you see the problem a little more clearly, consider subscribing, and feel free to share your thoughts below.